Thank you. Welcome to the third part of our study, and we are studying this week the dispensations of the Scriptures, the dispensations of God. Thus far, we were free to cover the first two of the dispensations of innocency or freedom, and the dispensation of conscience or self-determination. Now, each dispensation has specific features. Number one, there is a chief person standing at the head of each dispensation. Secondly, each dispensation has one or more names that somehow characterize what the dispensation is and how God is dispensing His economy at this particular time. Thirdly, each dispensation contains a specific responsibility. Fourthly, each dispensation contains a specific test. Fifthly, each dispensation ends in failure. Sixthly, this is followed by judgment, but seventhly, each dispensation shows some degree of the work of divine grace. Now today, let's look at the third dispensation called the dispensation of civil government. This covers the period of time that begins in Genesis chapter 8, verse 15, until Genesis chapter 11, verse 32. The first thing to note is the chief person. In this case, the chief person is Noah. Noah now receives new specific divine revelation that tells him exactly how the divine economy and dispensation of God will be run at this point. Secondly, concerning the name, the one key name for this dispensation is the dispensation of civil government. It was called that because it is with this particular dispensation that man is given the right of life and death, and he's given the authority to rule others. And the concept of ruling and having power to execute or not to execute contains within it the concepts of human government. And as it states, whosoever sheds man's blood, by man must his blood also be shed. And so man is given the authority to slay the murderer, to execute the murderer, and this, of course, carries within it the concept of rule, authority, and government. Thirdly, concerning the human responsibility in this dispensation, human responsibility was obedience to the Noahic covenant. Now, contained within the scope of the Noahic covenant was, again, that man must replenish and fill the earth in light of the destruction of humanity in the course of the flood. Furthermore, concerning what man was allowed to eat, until this event, man was allowed to eat only vegetables. Man was to be vegetarian in the two preceding dispensations. From this point on, however, man is allowed to go beyond that, and we are told he was allowed to eat any kind of meat he chooses without any limitations. Anything that moves he was able to eat, and no limitations whatsoever were placed under the Noahic covenant. Furthermore, the Noahic covenant was to establish human government, and God was going to dispense or to govern His economy through human government, and man was responsible to obey human government. And human government would have the authority to enforce its rules and regulations. And then, as a sign or a token of the Noahic covenant, there was the rainbow, and within the rainbow was the promise that God will never again destroy the earth with a flood. So that was basically the responsibility, obedience to the Noahic covenant. Now, fourthly, concerning the test was to rule properly and to spread out. They were to rule properly, but they were not to be under only one government in one place. God demanded that they dispense and disperse all over creation itself. But fifthly came the failure, and the failure was seen in what man tried to do in the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Failure was seen in that they tried to stay together using the Tower of Babel as a point of contact, as a point of center, as a point of staying together. Now, Tower of Babel would function both as a literal thing and also as a symbolic thing. As a literal thing, the Tower of Babel was an attempt to build a high tower for the purpose of the study of the stars. It was to reach unto heavens, was their claim. They were not trying to build a tower that would reach to God's heaven itself, rather a tower that was high, that would give good visibility for the studying of the stars, not for the sake of astronomy, but for the sake of astrology. And of course, the study of astrology means a repudiation of seeing God as the ultimate and only creator, and that he was in control and not the stars. But astrology was a repudiation of the worship of the one God, and so man began to move into polytheism, astrology, meaning he moved on into cultism, and all kinds of other sins as well. And behind all these things lay demonism. And that's where clearly the failure was seen. But that was the physical purpose of the Tower of Babel. The symbolic purpose was to deliberately disobey the command to spread all over the world. The purpose of the Tower of Babel was to serve as a center of attraction, to keep humanity together, so that they would not spread out and begin to lose contact among themselves. So basically, their intent was not to move outside the Babylonian area, not to move outside the area that lies between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. As a result of the failure came point number 6, which was the judgment, and the judgment was the confusion of tongues. As a result of their attempt to rebel against God's commands and authority, God did send a judgment upon them, and that was the confusion of tongues. One of the key things in being able to stay together was the fact that man of a certain segment of the world does have a common language. The reason why Germans tend to stay together in Germany is because of the German language keeping them together. The same thing is true with country after country after country. The common language tends to keep a certain segment of society cohesively together. But once there is a differentiation in language, you usually have wars, even when there's a difference in language within one country. And that is why sometimes there was civil war in various states in Europe, because one part of this nation spoke one language, another part spoke a different language, and so on. Where you have a lack of common language, you usually have turmoil, confusion, conflict, war, and so on. So by causing the confusion of tongues to enter into their experience, what God was able to accomplish was a forced dispersion. Now, it does not mean, of course, that every human being at that point spoke a different language altogether. What might have been is something like this. 5 people found that they were able to communicate and speak the same language, so these 5 people migrated somewhere to separate themselves from the others that they could not understand, and so as a result they would move to a certain part of the world and speak such and such a language. On the other hand, say 10 or 15 other people found themselves speaking the same language, and so they moved to another part of the world to separate themselves from those they could not understand and establish their own language group and therefore their own unique nationality. That's the way God accomplished his original intent, in that man was to spread out the entire world and to replenish it. Now finally, what about point number 7, grace? Was grace displayed during this period? And the answer is a hearty yes. Grace was indeed displayed, and the way we see the grace displayed is the fact that God preserved His remnant. The particular remnant that God has preserved after the flood are the particular names listed after the Tower of Babel incident, and that is the names of Genesis chapter 11 that trace the genealogy from Noah and Shem all the way down to Abraham, with whom God will begin the next dispensation. And so God did preserve a special, unique remnant, and there were followers of the one true God during this period, and that is how grace was displayed. And God maintained the seed line, and the promise He made concerning the seed of the woman continued to be preserved. And in spite of the flood, in spite of the Tower of Babel, God preserved the unique seed line through which the promise was going indeed to be fulfilled. So that is the third dispensation, the dispensation of civil government. But instead of using government properly, they tried to build empires instead. Something else I might point out before we close is concerning the failure. We see something else, and that is the story of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod was a mighty hunter, but he was also an empire builder. He was out to build his empires. And instead of seeing each kingdom being independent, he was trying to unify all kingdoms under his authority, and so he was the first empire builder. Nature of empires is to try to consolidate the separate kingdoms, which was God's original intent to begin with. We will continue with our study tomorrow, so until then we bid you Shalom.